Now that we've looked at the access control categories, let's look at the different types, and I think most of these make sense. But I know this is also one of the places where some of my students struggle. I think you just have to logic through it a couple of times, and once you've done that, it should make sense to you. So here are some of the ways I explain to my students when I see them struggling, and it's mostly just going through and saying, does this prevent something? Does this detect something? Does it correct something? Does it recover something? Does it deter or is it compensating? And as you can hear, what I just mentioned are the different types. And also remember, some of the things we implement here, just like we did with risk management, they can cover multiple types. A security guard is a good example. A security guard is a deterrent. It will deter someone from doing something. But they can also be detective. They can see something happening that shouldn't. They might be in person standing outside the building, or they might sit at a workstation and look at the monitors that display what's on the cameras. They might see someone trying to sneak in. A security guard can also be a compensating control. And kind of keep this in mind for the exam. Read all questions like a lawyer would. And I say lawyer because a lot of students tend to want to answer the questions they want to answer, not what they're being asked by the exam. And this is very dangerous. Answer exactly what the exam is asking. So read the question like a lawyer would and answer the actual question that they want answered. So you deconstruct the question and the answer options, and we will cover this later, I promise. And if you think of a security guard as only deterrent, but that's not an option, well, maybe think that security guard could also be a detective control or a compensating control. Keep in mind, this is an English exam, and that doesn't mean that it's just in English. They will also use words that to a large extent mean the same, but it isn't the specific word. You might read through the entire option and you know the answer should be something preventative, but maybe they use stop or block or advert. So what we need to do when we start deconstructing questions is looking at what are they really saying here. Yes, it is a preventative control, but that really just means we stop something, we prevent it. So read the entire question, read the answer options, deconstruct the questions into its essence, and then answer from that point of view. All right, enough ranting about the exam. So a preventative control is a control that prevents something from happening. That could be least privilege. Remember, mandatory access control, we only give people exactly enough access to do whatever they're doing. We don't give them anything else. We can do drug tests, and drug tests might seem counterintuitive because they're also detective. They detect something. But it's not the actual drug use we want to stop, it's the action that they might take. It could also be intrusion prevention systems. We will cover those. It can be firewalls, it can be encryption, and obviously this is not a complete list, but it is something that prevents some sort of malicious incident from happening. Then we have detective controls, and well, they detect something from happening either during or after an attack. That can be our logs. We can look in the logs and see the attack happening. That could be a camera. We can detect something is happening, even though we're not at the location where the camera is. They can help us detect something wrong. Then we have corrective controls. They either can stop an attack or they can fix a problem. Think of that like antivirus. Or it could be our patches. And I have spent a good deal of time here talking to students that don't think patches is a corrective control. Many of them think it should be preventative. And while they are technically slightly right, it does prevent stuff from happening because we fix the flaws that we have. It is really primarily a corrective control because we fix the problem that is there. We correct something. Now, if on the exam you get something about patches and corrective controls is not an answer option in any shape, way, or form, well then maybe look if there's something that looks like preventative. Next up, we have recovery controls. And again here, it makes sense, right? It helps us recover after an attack. This could be our disaster recovery plans, our cold sites, hot sites, warm sites. And yes, we will cover those much more in depth later. It could even just be our backups. It could be our high availability environment. Again, it is something that helps us recover. Then we have deterrent controls. Again, they deter, but they don't stop anything. They just make the target slightly less interesting. It can be a guard, a dog, a fence, lighting, even just a sign that says beware of dog. If someone wants to break into a house and there are 20 houses that doesn't have a beware of dog sign and there's one that does, I bet it's going to be most likely that the burglar is going to avoid the one with a beware of dog sign. Because why would he risk just the possibility of a dog being there when with the 20 other houses, it's less likely they're there? And under deterrent controls, I think we need to talk about fences. This is another one where I've been getting a lot of pushback from students because not all fences are created equally. How tall is a fence? That can be 2 feet, 6 feet, 10 feet. Is there barbed wire on top? So depending on which type of fence it is, it can be different types of controls. If it's a 2-foot fence or a 6-foot fence, maybe it's a deterrent. If it's a 10-foot fence with electricity running through it and barbed wire at the top, well then it's probably a preventative control. I guess the point here is don't just think of a control and then say this is definitely this, because many of them can be many different types of controls. A guard is most likely primarily a preventative control, but the guard can also be a detective control. They can also be a deterrent. And then the final one, compensating. Guards definitely fit in that category too. And compensating controls is really anything that we use to compensate for any of the other controls that are either impossible to do or too expensive. Let's just say for whatever reason there's a hole in our fence that's on the perimeter of our building. I'm sure there's a very good reason for that hole, but regardless, our perimeter is weaker. Well, then we can put a guard there. At that point, he's a compensating control to compensate for the missing fence. And here again, you can make a minigame out of this too. Whenever you see something in your environment, it doesn't have to be at your work. That's some sort of control. Logic your way through it, talk through it. What type of control is this primarily? And are there any of the other categories this can fit into? And before we end this lecture, I'm going to give you a trick that I've used for many years when I take certification exams. Even way before I started teaching others, I talk to myself, I argue with myself, and I do it a lot. I will explain how things work to myself, but if you have someone else you can talk to and explain things to, that is going to make you understand things so much better. So my wife, completely non-technical, but she has an insane amount of IT security knowledge. Because to ensure that I understand a topic completely, I explain it to her. But if you don't have someone who wants to listen to you for hours and hours when you talk, well then talk to yourself. It really does work. And I think the deeper understanding here is very important, both for your job, but also for the exam. There are some things on the exam you can memorize your way out of, but I think it's very critical that you understand how this knowledge applies and how it works in our environment. Hence the arguing and talking to yourself. Give it a try. It might work for you. And just to recap, in this lecture, we talked about administrative or directive controls. Those are our policies and our procedures. Then we had technical or logical controls. That's our hardware, software, firmware, but all that is configured based on our policies and our procedures that we got from the administrative controls. Then we have the physical controls. Those are the locks, the fences, the guards, the dogs, the bollards, all that stuff. Things you can physically touch. Again here, all things here are done based on our policies and procedures. Then we talked about the different access control types. Preventative, it stops something from happening. It prevents it. Detective, it detects an attack either during or after. Corrective, it corrects an attack. Recovery helps us recover after an attack. Deterrent, it deters an attack. That was the smaller fences, right? It doesn't necessarily prevent anything, but it can make it less likely for something to happen. And then finally, we had compensating controls. They're the ones that we put in place where it's not feasible to do any of the others, but based on our security posture, we need to have something in place here. That was the guard at the fence. I hope that has helped you get a better understanding of access control categories and types. And with that, we are done with this lecture. Thank you for being here, and I will see you in the next lecture.